Hello, I'm Shawn Wallis. I'm here to talk about exposing your SaaS. The alternative title, I always like to give an alternative title, is It's My Day and I'll Cry If I Want To, which is a riff off the old song, It's My Party, I'll Cry If I Want to. I'm head of threat modeling over at PayPal. I'm also an advisor to a Silent Push, which is a DNS Intel entropy company. I'm a DEF CON goon for many years and a Black Hat volunteer, and live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So it's first time at SAINTCON, first time in Utah. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. Disclaimer, IP, memes, etc. So talk goals. I really want to share something cool that I kind of worked on. I had a lot of encouragement from some of my network and friends. So I'm going to walk through how I came about this, really kind of discuss it, really the concept. I do a lot of what I would call innovation type stuff, where I take a problem and I step back and say, okay, I can solve this simple thing, but how can I solve the bigger thing? And then how can I automate it? And then how can I do it proactively? So be sharing a lot of results with that and encourage other people to go down the same path, right? I really want people to collaborate and to kind of figure out their own path of how can I do cool stuff like this? So kind of the background of this, of how this came about, is in my previous company, someone one day sent me a link and they were like, hey, check this out. And I went to the link and it was some whiteboard site. And I was like, okay, well, there's some sensitive stuff there. That's not really cool. And they're like, yeah, it's exposed to the internet, right? So I sent it to my personal machine and tried it, and sure enough, I could get in. So I was like, huh, that's interesting. I don't know what to do with it. It was thanks for sending it to me, but it's not something I really wanted to chase down. So a couple days later, he sent me a second link, and it was a little more sensitive stuff. And I was like, okay, now I'm seeing a trend here. And I did some research on the site and found even more stuff. And I was like, okay, cool. And then not only a week later, somebody sent me another one. And this one was interesting to me. This was our CEO having basically an all hands with all his staff. And there were three kind of important things. It was who's who in the company was important, what their agenda was, and their contact, including their email and their phone numbers. And I was like, this is the perfect stuff that any attacker would want of who the leaders they should attack are, and it's all exposed to the internet if you know the right link. So I was like, okay, now I got a couple different sites. And I was like, I don't know, really still didn't know what to do with this. I sat on it for like a month, and then I had this idea after looking at the data. And what I came to is, if I knew what these sites were, it would be easy to find. Go search for, Dropbox, go first search for Miro or something, right? But I didn't know what our SaaS sites were. We have a CASB, but it's not really helpful, right? As most CASBs aren't. And there's just so many potentials out here. I didn't know what to look at. So I wanted to know, how could I look at what site should I be looking for? And then figure out, well, if they're sharing data, how can I figure that out versus manually having to go to all these sites? And can I do it proactively, and can I automate it? So that's what I put together. So the whole CASB discussion, right? I talked to a lot of vendors about this, about the problem I was trying to solve. And they all came to me and said, well, CASB is trying to solve basically RBAC access issues of, hey, I want to control what somebody at this site can get to, what they can get to here, right? And give you logs and access to that. And I'm like, no, I care about the data, what's going there. I'm like, oh, well, if you do data classification, we can figure that out. And I'm like, well, if it's a whiteboard site or something, how are you going to classify that data? It's not a file. It's pictures, it's images, it's text, right? So finally, I ran into a couple and said, you know what? The problem, we don't have a solution. The problem you're trying to solve is kind of a next level problem. And then they started to discuss things like next-gen CASB, CASB 2.0. So a lot of the companies I talked to were interested in what I was doing because I was solving a problem they hadn't thought about. So now, I do want to say the main thing on this is it requires SSL decryption, right? And a lot of people still groan about that because they're not able to do that or are not doing that. So I just want to call that up front, but the rest is pretty open. SIM, have your proxy logs, right? Just have a creative mind and thinking about how to attack this. And then a little bit of patience, and I mentioned, hey, if you're using Splunk, it's going to be a lot of patience. Unless you have a big data solution, it's much better. But trying to pull that volume of Splunk logs, definitely in the sizing environments I was doing was problematic, and I had to do very small windows. Luckily, we did have a big data solution that really sped things up for me. So now getting into the concept. So looking at all these sites, right, the interesting thing that came out to me, and was this amazing, the thing was, these all have the same patterns here of what the URLs look like. But the last part is where the data is. So you can start to say, oh, well, I'm starting to see this pattern, right? I'm starting to see the URL structures are the same except for that last bit. Now, how many sites are you normally go to that have a directory structure that are the same? As you move through that tree, that directory structure changes. But if you're hitting different data elements, then you are now clued in that there's different data on these sites, right? So we kind of broke this down and said, okay, I have my domain, now I have my directory, and we call this, or for what purpose, we just called it a stem. There are many other names that you could call this. But it was important to bring this up because now I could kind of look at this pattern and start to say, well, show me things that have the same, everything minus the stem, and let's do some counts on that. So when we start looking at the data, and I'll get into some of the results in the next slide to kind of show how this works, but you really want to say, if I'm looking at like Dropbox or something, how many different of those stems are unique, right? And now you start to get unique elements that rise to the top, and you can say, well, these are sites that have a lot of data elements, right? Which start to say these may be SaaS sites that I didn't know about, or even maybe they're not even a SaaS site. Maybe they're, you'll see a couple in the results which are entertaining, right, to look at. Initially, that data will be very overwhelming. You'll start to get some Google results, right, a lot of cache results, CDN stuff, so you have to kind of narrow your focus down. How I did that, I eliminated the search engines, I looked at the error messages, right, status codes, anything at 404, I just eliminated. Session size can be a good tell, right? Anything with data is going to be above a certain size. The problem with this is if you're using Splunk and you're doing this at a large scale of data, this is just making your Splunk query more complex. So I ended up having to do a lot of this either through post-processing or on a big data solution to speed it up, or Splunk just kind of fell to the knees. So kind of looking at the results here, this is kind of what it starts to look like. So you start now to see that these are your directories, as I called it, with your unique stems, right? So you see, like, for instance, I didn't even know we use Figma, right? Nobody actually did that I talked to. So seeing that and seeing all of these links, we were now able to go and check these data things out and see, are they ours? Are they another company's? Is it sensitive? Can anybody access it? Et cetera, et cetera. Now you can see in here, there are some interesting false positives per se, like Etsy, right, is giving the same thing. And you start to go to Etsy and you see what people are shopping for. So the cool thing about this is I found some cool Christmas gifts, right? Hey, I didn't know some of the, Etsy had so much cool stuff. So being able to see that, but going through here, right? Now I know that Figma has 308 unique data elements, and it's time to go and say, well, what's in that data, right? So we can talk about how we can kind of automate that. This is kind of more of an example of what that data looks like, right? I just blurred this out to make it easier, but you can kind of definitely see they're all unique elements in here, and you can start to kind of just, usually I kind of spot check this myself, just hitting a couple, seeing, hey, did this work or not, right? But then we get to the fun part where we actually can go test the data. So now that I have all of this data, yeah, I can go pull this. I put some benign stuff up here, but I definitely in my testing have found some more interesting things, right? For instance, some of the companies that we've been working with, people will share data to us. So it's not necessarily our data, but it's still people putting their data out there. And I've definitely found W-2s, 1099s, et cetera, tax returns that people put out there and then share with you saying, hey, here, come get my data for whatever purpose, right? And I'm kind of looking at that like, somebody should tell them, right? Good practices and things like that. So I recommend dumping this and doing this from an external machine. And the main reason for that is a lot of these sites can whitelist IP address space and say, you know what, don't require authentication or don't prompt for access if it's coming from this IP range. So when doing this from an external box, you are getting a true positive of, can I access this data, right? You may be doing SSO behind the scenes, you may not see that, right? Also, there could be some rate limiting in place, one way or the other, and you just need to be cognizant of that. It's interesting, the sites that don't have rate limiting, and I can talk a little bit more about a particular one, I think. So it's pretty simple, right? Just initially how I did this was just a curl loop, right? Is I just took all that data and said, dude, just go hit every URL. And let's just go by the error messages, right? You will start to see some of them will prompt you for login and stuff, and you can filter that out in your curl response data as well. But it's as simple as this, right? It's just hitting the data, see what you can respond to, and then figuring out, can I get to that data or not? Is it sensitive or not? Back on some of the data, it's really interesting is when I was looking through here, I saw all sorts of data, right? This was a job posting. This was all the SAT answers, which I'm not even sure if that's okay, to be honest. Like, I don't know if that's a study guide or not, but like I would see menus from company, from restaurants. I would see coloring pages, mixed in with the sensitive data. So this kind of goes longer term to what I was trying to do. I was like, okay, this is great, but what if I could do something with like some machine learning of parsing that data out, looking for keywords or looking for things that started to say, these are the things I care about, these are the things that would be sensitive, this would be not. So that was kind of the area where I was taking this for more of that automation, because I didn't want to have to go review every one of these images, as entertaining as it was, believe me, right? Seeing what people are storing out there. But at the end of the day, I had other things I wanted to get to work on. So this is really it. So, the SaaS marketplace is expanding. So many companies are just coming up overnight, right, and bringing new things up. And they're not thinking about security. So, we were onboarding so many SaaS sites. So being able to kind of see this and see the data and see these patterns of like, oh, hey, I've never seen this site before. What's going on here? And then reaching out even to our teams. Oh, yeah, we're doing a POC. Forgot security, right? It was like, great. So this became a good identifying thing of when we could proactively make sure that the right controls were in place. But the industry needs more solutions like this. What sites are being used and what data is being shared there, and not from a data classification, but being able to really understand things that are not file-based and whatnot. Are we supposed to be doing that? Yes or no, right? So this is really kind of a cool thing to do with threat hunting. I really recommend that. Again, kind of taking through the process here, a lot of this was more about innovation and thinking about an idea of saying, well, I have this particular problem. Yeah, I could have just looked at the one site and then all the neighboring sites, but taking a step back and saying, how can I take a step back and see all the sites? And then not only that, how can I automate that? How can I make this proactive? How can I turn this into a part of somebody's job, whether it's threat hunting or in their SOC or something now, where they're checking for this, or even in your DLP team, right, and doing that. So that's really what I kind of enjoy through this whole process is I took something, right, and I had a lot of support behind it as well. I was kind of questionable, like, hey, how exciting was this? And I had a lot of my network, so I would call out thanks to a lot of them who were able to show support and such. So I know that was a quick presentation, but we have time for questions if anyone has any. Oh, thanks. I can see you there, barely. Yeah, that's a great question. And if anyone didn't hear, although you were very loud, so thank you. What did I automate, right? And really, there were, I think, essentially three phases of that, of the automation. And the first automation was collecting of the data, right? So I wrote API things to pull down the logs from Splunk or a big data solution to get those logs in place, right? Of understanding what are those unique data elements and what should those sites be that I'm pulling. Once I had that data, then pass it off to a system that went and retrieved that data. And in some cases, we actually did samples of the data because we started to find some sites that looked like they would hold data, but they were more like a Salesforce or a ticketing system where, right, that it was always going to be protected data. So either we did that from a manual perspective or we did that from a sampling perspective because of the scale. And then the third part is once we had all the response of that data, we started to automate through that kind of machine learning part of can we figure out, is this sensitive, is this not? Is this a menu, is this a 1099 or W-2, right? Is there socials here, is there, numbers or data here, right? And how we were doing that was partly through AI or partly more machine learning where we just fed it a ton of sensitive data and tried to build a model that knew the difference between the two. I hope that helps. Any other questions? All righty. Well, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.